Okay, everyone. Having now covered combinatorial chemistry and structure-activity relationships, we will now look at the third skill set in your lab skills toolkit, which is molecular modeling. We will look at what molecular modeling is and how molecular modeling can speed up the process of drug discovery. So let's look at this diagram from Microsoft Research that outlines the concept of the drug discovery pipeline that we talked about earlier. This is the drug discovery pipeline from target and disease all the way to a therapy and a cure, if you want to call it that way. So first, we're identifying a target that is associated with a disease, something we can address. Then we develop candidates, chemical candidates that could target the receptor or the protein. Now, this cycle between proposing a target and testing it is very slow when it's led by humans. It's very, very slow. It's what we talked about earlier. The conventional pipeline is very slow. So in this cycle that is slow, you could instead go and use in silico modeling. So here we see this funnel approach where you start with millions of potential compounds and you funnel that down to a few high potency compounds. And those you can then test in vitro. And this is a much faster pipeline than the human lab one. And then from the in vitros we talked about, you go through animal testing and human testing, and ultimately a medicine on the market. And so we want to now look at what modeling is. So first, we look at molecular mechanics, which is a static model. It's a model or method to represent a protein or a drug in terms of hard spheres on springs. So let's look at that quickly. So here you have an alkane. This is just propane. And we can represent propane as 3 hard spheres. And every bond, these are single bonds, sigma bonds, you can represent those as vibrational springs with a certain stiffness. And the stiffness is governed by Hooke's law. And you may remember that from A-level chemistry and physics. So Hooke's law says that the potential energy U is related to 1/2 of the spring force constant and the extension X of the spring, which is to the power of 2. So for instance, here is this example, right? You have a hard sphere, or in this case, a hard cube, and it is vibrating on the spring. And the spring has a certain extension, X, and it has a certain stiffness. And the energy to do this process of extending it out is 1/2 kx squared. And so based on that idea, we're going to now calculate the system potential energy U of your protein and drug system as a sum of energetic terms. So let's have a look at this very complicated equation. So U system, which is a system potential energy, is a sum of bonded potential energy and non-bonded potential energy. So these are terms that are on the spring. These are terms that are far away and not connected by springs. And so the bonded energy can also be split into the following components: the bond potential energy, the angular potential energy, the torsional potential energy, and some further terms. And the non-bonded potential energy can be considered as a sum of dispersion potential energy and electrostatic potential energy. Okay, this sounds complicated. And so to do this, we're going to introduce what's called a force field This sounds very sci-fi. And it is to some extent because they were developed in the 70s when Star Wars and Star Trek and those kind of theories were popular. But really all it is a collection of those terms that I've just said for the system potential energy. And then it's called force field because the potential energy is related to the force by the derivative per atom. Okay, so, and we will come to what we use the force for later. Right now, I want to reiterate, we obtain the system potential energy as a sum of the terms that I have here in this table, and that I also have listed in this equation. So again, just to reiterate, the force field components are bonded potentials, angular potentials, torsional, also known as dihedral potentials, additional bonded terms that you can add to fit your model better, non-bonded electrostatics, and non-bonded dispersion forces. Okay, so you might say, well, Christian, give me an example. So we have the example here. So we have the full force field equation in its entire level of precision. So we have here the Hookean potential for bonds, which tells you about the energy of interaction between two atoms that are bonded and which have a certain separation. Depending on the separation, the energy of interaction is greater or smaller. Notice this K is different from the Hooke. It's a large K, and it incorporates that 1/2. Okay. Then you have angular terms. That's the energy of interaction of atom 1 and 3 on this angle, where they're bonded by a second atom 2. Then you have dihedral terms. Dihedral terms tell us of the interaction of atom 1 and 4 as they see each other, as they're bonded in this way. So this is maybe a little hard to imagine, but it tells you. So if we view, let me just get this. If we view the line of sight this direction, you're effectively seeing just here. So you're seeing two atoms, 1 and 4, and they can rotate and either eclipse each other, or be at 90 degrees, or be at 180 degrees, and depending on what angle they have a different interaction energy. This is called the dihedral term, so it's a little hard to maybe visualize. As I said, then you can have additional bonded terms known as Urey-Brateley and improper dihedrals. The impropers are actually quite interesting and quite useful. The improper dihedral keeps are added to ensure planarity of, for instance, benzene groups. And so you need to add all of this to account for your system potential energy to be exact. And then you have the non-bonded terms here, known as dispersion and electrostatic terms. So the dispersion term is this one. You can find this in Atkins physical chemistry if you want to learn more. But it's effectively called the 12-6 potential. So it has a repulsive and an attractive term. And here you also have the diagram. This is the dispersion interaction between, for instance, atom 1 and 4. This is effectively an interaction that these atoms feel each other at a distance. Okay, and it's based solely on some permittivity constants and a separation constant. There's no charge in this because it's a dispersion term. And then there is the electrostatic term, which is over here. And this, for those who've done A-level physics, you will recognize this as a Coulomb potential. It's very simple. It tells you the electrostatic energy between two charges, 2-point charges. In this case, we can think of the point charges as like atom 1 and 2, or 1 and 4, etc. It just says that the potential energy between those 2-point charges, Q I and QJ, where I and J are indices that can mean any kind of atom in the grouping, is the product of the charges. So here it really matters how charged the atoms are. Okay, larger charge means larger electrostatic potential. Divided by some terms, 4 pi epsilon naught Rij. Let me just explain this. So 4 pi is a geometric term that arises from the derivation of this model. Then you have epsilon naught, which is the permittivity of free space. That basically tells you what medium you're in. Are you in water? Are you in vacuum? And you can look the values up, okay? And then you have Rij, which is the separation of the 2-point charges, okay? So that's your model. That's your force field. This seems really complicated. And you might ask, why do we need to know this? Well, you don't need to know this. The computer calculates this for you at every step. And then I've just mentioned the word step. Why step? You know, this you said, Christian, this is a static model. Well, it is a static model. When it's called molecular mechanics, okay? And now we're going to take this model and make it dynamic, okay? So a bit like here. Mechanics is, say, when the spring is stiff and not moving, and then dynamics is when you want to see the dynamics, okay? This is now called molecular dynamics simulations. Let's see if we can get the video started there. So here we have a molecular dynamics simulation of caffeine penetrating a skin bilayer. Okay, so this is called transdermal delivery. So let's talk a little bit about what this is, and we have lots of time. So we use a static molecular mechanics model to generate dynamic models of molecules as hard spheres connected by springs. This was shown by Levitt and Warshall in 1975, together with electrostatic and dispersion terms. Okay, this turned out to be much more accurate than we thought, and molecular dynamics simulations now generate trajectories of a system by a forward time propagation of Newton's second law. That's a complicated way of saying we can make movies of atoms as they move in time. Okay. Let's look a little bit at this diagram. So here's an example of this is your energy surface, okay? Energy of your system. So what this means, low point is low energy, and a kind of a mountain, like this is a mountain, is a high energy point in your system. So so molecular dynamics, you always start in the valley, okay? So you're in the valley, like a little city. And molecular dynamics is just you exploring the park. You can think of this as, yeah, like a national park in Switzerland or something. So you start in the valley, in the town, basically, and you go on a kind of exploration adventure. You start exploring the little hill here. And eventually, if you simulate long enough, your molecular dynamics will take you over the little hill, and it will take you to a nearby village. Okay, so this is the analogy you can think of when it comes to molecular dynamics. And this is really cool because, you know, we can now start from a certain point and doing nothing, because we're not telling the system to do anything. We just start the exploration, and it's naturally going to cross this barrier if you simulate long enough and arrive to a nearby village. You can even go and explore this very high energy region, though sometimes those are inaccessible to our models. And this video is an example of that. If you simulate long enough, you will see the caffeine molecule go from all the way here to all the way here. So again, here's the start. If you simulate long enough, you're going to basically, this is village 1 right here. And then you let it explore and you simulate long enough. Eventually it starts to cross this barrier, which is this bilayer, and it will arrive to the second village. Okay, let's put this in a more mathematical terminology now. So this is your force field. It calculates the exact energy of the system at a point in time, okay? But it's not a dynamic model. So we're now going to use the molecular dynamics algorithm to generate these videos. First, at point one, we're going to give every atom a velocity. That means they have a vector and they get pushed in some direction. Some go this way, some go up, right? This is why you see all these vibrations. Then you calculate the forces on all the atoms. That's called generating the force field. Now, because the force field and the forces are related, you know the force. And because you know the force, you can use Newton's second law to dictate the dynamics. And Newton's second law says that the force of an atom is related to the mass times its acceleration. So if we know the force, and we know the mass is a constant, mass of carbon is 12, mass of etc. Then if we know the force and we know the mass, we can know the acceleration. Acceleration tells you direction of travel. Okay, it's like sitting in a car, you know the acceleration. And so you know which way it's going to go. And then we say, okay, we're now going to move every atom a little tiny step because we know which direction they're heading in. We let them move. And then we redo the whole process. We move everything at a very slow time step. And then we recalculate the energy of the system, move it again, recalculate the energy of the system. And this is this loop, okay? That's called the molecular dynamics loop. And this is, you do this millions of times and you get this video, okay? That's the algorithm. That's how we get this video. So just in summary, here's my molecular mechanics static model that tells me the energy of the system. Okay, and it's based on this concept of the energy of springs of hard sphere or hard cube atoms on springs. And because I know the energy of these, I can sum them up and get the energy of the system. And then if I use this to propagate velocities in time, I can generate movies of the system. And this is exactly how the systems would move according to Newtonian physics, which happens to be very accurate way of describing the movement. This is effectively what's happening inside a cell. Okay, so we're like zooming in on a cell and we can calculate and describe the exact interactions, more detailed than spectroscopy, more detailed than confocal or other techniques. And not just that, you have access to the exact time of the processes. So there are lots of things we can do with this. Okay, so let's just recap. What is a molecular dynamic simulation? Well, it's a general algorithm in which you initialize the atom positions and you give them a velocity. So the position starts from a structure. So you need to come up with a structure of your system. That could be a structure of a membrane, or it could be an X-ray structure of a protein. That you need as a starting point. And then you give every atom an energy. You give them a little kick. And then you start to predict where they're going to move next based on the initial energy you've given them. And the next movement comes from knowing the direction of the velocities. They all have little arrows. One is moving this way, one is moving that way, and then you move them in slow time.